Story 1. The Repeating Mile. Robert Hayes had been driving commercial routes for 37 years. He knew the highways like some men knew their own driveways. Every exit, every service station, every treacherous curve etched into his memory. He'd hauled freight across America in every season through blizzards and heat waves, and never once had he felt genuinely afraid behind the wheel. That changed on a Tuesday evening in May of 2023, somewhere between Barstow and Victorville on Interstate 15, when Robert discovered that the same stretch of highway could repeat itself with terrifying precision. It started innocuously enough. Robert was hauling a load of industrial machinery to Las Vegas, a route he'd driven more times than he could count. His rig was a Peterbilt 579, a machine he'd owned outright for 6 years and maintained religiously. The evening was clear, the temperature moderate, and the traffic mercifully light. Robert had stopped for fuel and coffee at a truck stop near Barstow, checked his logs, and confirmed he was within his hours. He'd been on the road for 6 hours with another 5 ahead. Everything was routine, predictable, safe. The highway stretched before him in the gathering dusk, that peculiar purple-gray light that descends just before full darkness in the desert. Robert had his favorite country station playing softly, a thermos of black coffee wedged into the cup holder, and his CB radio on the standard channel in case any other drivers needed information about road conditions or accidents ahead. He passed the Nebo exit marker at 7:43 p.m. He remembered checking the dashboard clock specifically because he was calculating his arrival time in Vegas. The road was practically empty, just the occasional car heading south, their headlights briefly illuminating the opposite lane before disappearing into the darkness. At 7:51 p.m., Robert noticed something odd. The exit marker he'd just passed, the one reading Nebo 2 miles, appeared again in his headlights. Robert blinked, adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, and checked his odometer. The numbers showed he'd traveled approximately 1.3 miles since the last marker. That should have put him well past it. He watched the road ahead carefully, expecting to see the next exit marker, but instead at 8:07 p.m. exactly, his headlights illuminated another sign reading Nebo 2 miles. The exact same sign, the exact same wording, the exact same deterioration pattern in the reflective surface where a bullet hole had torn through the enamel years ago. Robert pulled onto the shoulder of the highway and killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the cooling tick of the diesel engine and the faint whisper of wind across the cab. He reached for his phone to check his GPS, but the screen remained dark. The battery was fully charged. He'd plugged it in at the truck stop. He tried the power button again. Nothing. The device was dead in a way that seemed profoundly unnatural, as if it had never possessed the capacity to function. He sat in the cab for 10 minutes, watching the highway behind him illuminate briefly with the headlights of occasional vehicles traveling in either direction. Nothing seemed wrong with the world outside his truck. The darkness was normal. The stars were visible above. The desert stretched away in its familiar undulations. Robert told himself he'd miscalculated his position, that his tired brain had played a trick on him. He'd been driving for 7 hours. His cognitive functions weren't as sharp as they used to be. He restarted the truck and pulled carefully back onto the highway. For the next 24 minutes, he drove with meticulous attention to the odometer and the kilometer markers visible in his headlights. At exactly 8:32 p.m., the Nebo exit marker appeared again. The same sign, the same bullet hole. Robert's hands began to tremble slightly. He checked his watch. He'd been driving for 25 minutes since pulling over. By his speed and the distance the odometer showed, he should have progressed 7 miles at minimum. Instead, he was seeing the same exit marker for the 3rd time. The cold that spread through Robert's chest had nothing to do with the air conditioning he'd set to 70 degrees. He activated his CB radio and transmitted on channel 19, the standard trucker frequency. Breaker, breaker, this is Big Blue on I-15 southbound, mile marker 178. Can anyone out there verify my position? I'm experiencing some navigation anomalies. For a long moment, nothing but white noise. Then a voice crackled through, weathered and uncertain. Who is this? I read you. Big Blue, southbound past Barstow, approximately mile marker 178. Can you confirm the next southbound exit? The pause extended longer this time. When the voice returned, it carried an edge of concern. Breaker, there's nothing at 178 southbound. That mile marker's in the northbound lane. You sure about your position? Robert's stomach tightened. I'm looking at a Nebo exit sign directly ahead. Nebo exits up near... Hold on. Another pause, the sound of what might have been a map rustling. Nebo exit is mile marker 193 northbound. You're reading that marker from the other side of the divide, buddy. You need to get your GPS checked. Robert thanked the driver and disconnected. He drove carefully onward, maintaining steady speed, watching the mile markers incrementally increase. 179, 180, 181. But the Nebo exit signs kept appearing. At 9:15 p.m. he passed it again. The same sign with the same bullet hole configuration, now so familiar that he could have drawn it from memory. The fourth appearance. By midnight, Robert had counted 8 identical Nebo exit signs. His coffee had gone cold and bitter in the thermos. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel with tension. He couldn't fully release. The highway had taken on a dreamlike quality, though the details remained hyper-realistic. The individual rocks visible in his headlights, the specific pattern of dust on the windshield, the subtle variations in asphalt color showing the age and maintenance history of different road sections. Everything was real. Everything was normal. Everything was wrong. At 1:47 a.m., Robert forced himself to stop again. He pulled into a flat area beside the highway, killed the engine, and sat in absolute darkness except for the distant stars. He tried his phone again. It remained powerless, a dead brick of glass and plastic in his trembling hand. He checked his fuel gauge. He'd used approximately half a tank's worth of fuel since his last fill-up, the consumption rate consistent with his actual driving speed. According to his engine logs, he'd traveled 43 miles. Yet he could see the Nebo exit marker from where he sat, perfectly visible in the night, exactly as it had been for the past 5 hours. Robert had never experienced a panic attack before, but he recognized one approaching. His breathing quickened. His heart hammered against his ribs. The enclosed space of the cab seemed to shrink around him. He forced himself to perform the breathing exercises his late wife had taught him for stress management. Long, deliberate inhalations through his nose, even slower exhalations through his mouth. After 10 minutes, his panic receded to a manageable level of dread. He restarted the truck and drove forward once more, no longer trying to understand what was happening, simply moving through it as one moved through a nightmare. The Nebo signs continued their regular appearances. Every 24 to 28 minutes, the identical exit marker would materialize in his headlights, and Robert would pass beneath it once more. At 3:33 a.m., he counted the 14th passage. His fuel gauge now read nearly empty. He should have needed to refuel long ago. Something shifted at 4:17 a.m. Robert saw the Nebo exit marker approaching and braced himself for its appearance in his headlights. But as he drew closer, the sign began to shimmer and distort, its surface undulating like water. Robert eased off the accelerator, watching as the sign became increasingly difficult to focus on, the letters warping and stretching until they were illegible. For a moment, it seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. He could see it directly ahead, but also somehow to his left and right, as if the sign was rotating through dimensions he couldn't quite grasp. Then it was gone. The highway stretched ahead into darkness, the familiar markers replaced by an exit sign reading Baker 18 miles. Robert checked his odometer. It showed he'd traveled 206 miles since Barstow. The time displayed on his dashboard read 4:19 a.m. Somewhere between 4:16 and 4:19, something fundamental had changed. The highway had released him. Robert continued driving in a state of shock, part of him expecting the Nebo signs to return, for the loop to reassert itself. But they didn't. The exit markers progressed naturally. He reached his fuel stop in Baker at 5:42 a.m., his tank nearly empty, and sat in the diesel pumps for an hour, simply breathing, unable to move. The morning was dawning clear and normal over the desert. Other trucks pulled in and out. Drivers conducted normal business. Nothing in the world outside his perception indicated that anything extraordinary had occurred. When Robert finally checked his CB logs on his truck's communication system, he found something that made his blood run cold. The transmission he'd made at 8:32 p.m. requesting position verification had no corresponding response in the system's memory. It was as if the conversation had never happened, despite his clear recollection of another driver's voice answering his call. The entire incident existed only in his mind and in the empty fuel tank of his truck. Robert filed an incident report with his company and requested 2 weeks off. He met with a neurologist who found nothing wrong with his brain function. The truck was examined by his mechanic and found to be in perfect working order. No one had any explanation for what Robert had experienced. When he returned to driving 3 weeks later, he took a different route entirely, adding an extra 4 hours to his journey but avoiding that particular stretch of Interstate 15. He never passed the Nebo exit marker again. But Robert never again trusted the highway in quite the same way. He became hyper-aware of his odometer readings and his surroundings. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a part of him wondered if that stretch of road was still there, if those exit signs still repeated in their terrible sequence, waiting for another driver to stumble into their geometric loop and lose hours of linear time to the desert's impossible geography. He never drove I-15 between Barstow and Victorville again, and he warned every driver he met at truck stops about that particular route, speaking in hushed tones about mile markers that didn't progress and exits that repeated endlessly. Most drivers dismissed his warnings as the rambling of someone suffering from too many hours on the road. But the smart ones, the veterans who'd seen things that defied rational explanation, they listened. They understood that some places on the highway weren't quite right, where the normal rules of distance and time didn't apply with full consistency. They gave those places a wide berth and didn't ask too many questions about what existed in the spaces where the rules broke down. Robert Hayes had learned that lesson the hard way, and he carried it with him for the remainder of his driving career. Story 2. The Passenger in the Mirror. Patricia Sullivan had accumulated 29 years of driving experience across almost every American highway system. She was known among the community of female long-haul drivers as someone with an almost preternatural ability to navigate complicated logistics and maintain perfect vehicle safety records. Her company had awarded her their Driver Excellence Award 5 consecutive years. She'd never had an accident, never received a traffic citation, never been late on a delivery. Patricia was the kind of driver that other drivers wanted to ride with, the kind you trusted in bad weather or difficult situations. Which is why what happened on a desolate stretch of Montana highway in July of 2023 felt even more violating to her sense of order and safety. Patricia was transporting agricultural equipment from Billings toward Missoula, a 6-hour route she'd driven dozens of times. Her Kenworth T680 was new enough to have all the latest safety features: backup camera, lane departure warning, advanced collision avoidance systems. She was comfortable in the vehicle, familiar with all its technological features, and she maintained meticulous logs of her driving and rest periods. The afternoon was clear and warm, the kind of day where the Montana landscape sprawled in all its vast emptiness around the highway like an endless ocean of grassland and distant mountains. Patricia was approximately 2 hours into her route when she first noticed something odd about her convex driver's side mirror. She was passing an 18-wheeler traveling northbound on the opposite side of the highway, and in the reflection of her mirror she should have seen the truck moving away behind her. Instead, she saw something else entirely, a figure standing in the road, motionless, watching her pass. The image was only visible for a second or two before the truck she was passing moved out of the range of the mirror's reflection. But it was distinctive enough that Patricia found herself thinking about it for the next few minutes. She'd seen what appeared to be a person standing alone on the highway, dressed in clothes that seemed out of place in the summer landscape. The figure had appeared pale, almost luminescent, and seemed to be facing toward Patricia's truck rather than looking away. Patricia assumed she'd misinterpreted some road construction equipment or a roadside sign that her tired brain had briefly processed as a human figure. 40 minutes later, she stopped at a truck stop to use the facilities and grab coffee. She checked her mirror during her visual walk-around of the truck and found it to be in perfect condition, positioned correctly. The glass was clean, undamaged, reflecting everything as it should. There was nothing unusual about the mirror. Patricia proceeded with her journey, the image largely forgotten. But it returned 2 hours later in a different mirror. Patricia was adjusting her position in her seat, having been driving continuously for 5 hours, when she glanced up at her interior rearview mirror and saw the same pale figure standing in the road behind her. Except this time, Patricia was driving on a 2-lane highway with no other traffic visible, and the figure was centered directly in the mirror, standing on the asphalt behind her truck, unmoving. Patricia's reaction was immediate and physiological, her skin raised in goosebumps, her breath caught in her throat, and her hands tightened on the steering wheel. She immediately checked her backup camera, but the image was normal. Empty highway, the roadway stretching back toward the horizon, no figure visible. She pulled over at the next opportunity, which happened to be a small rest area just off the highway. Patricia was shaking as she undid her seatbelt and stepped down from the cab. She walked around to each mirror and examined them carefully. All perfectly normal, all reflecting the landscape and sky behind them accurately. The backup camera showed the empty parking area behind her truck. Everything was as it should be. Patricia sat on the concrete step of her truck for 15 minutes, trying to calm her racing heart. She told herself she'd been driving too long without proper rest, that highway hypnosis could create visual hallucinations, that she was experiencing some kind of stress-induced perceptual glitch. She called her dispatch and reported that she was taking an extended break, as was her prerogative. She rested in her cab for 2 hours, drank water, ate a protein bar, and used meditation techniques to center herself. When she resumed driving, she felt more stable, more present, more convinced that whatever she'd experienced had been a product of mental fatigue rather than anything external or supernatural. The figure appeared again 50 miles later, this time in her side mirror on the passenger side. Patricia was in the act of changing lanes when she caught the image, the pale figure standing on the highway, watching her. This time, Patricia's fear had transformed into something closer to anger. She was tired, she was stressed, and whatever her mind was producing, she was done entertaining it. She focused on the road ahead, on her driving, on the concrete tasks of operating her vehicle safely. She refused to look at the mirrors. She refused to acknowledge the apparition. She drove on, but by mile marker 322, Patricia had seen the figure approximately 15 times. It had appeared in every mirror on her truck, both side mirrors, the interior rear view, even briefly in the driver's side window as she'd been passing another vehicle. Each appearance was similar. The pale figure positioned as if waiting for her, watching her with an attention that felt intensely focused. The figure never moved, never gesticulated, never changed its expression or posture. It simply appeared and existed in her field of vision for varying lengths of time before disappearing from view. By the time Patricia was approaching Missoula, her hands were shaking continuously. She'd stopped 4 times to examine all her mirrors, to check her backup camera, to verify that nothing was physically wrong with any reflective surface on the truck. Everything functioned perfectly. The images were clean and clear. Nothing was loose or malfunctioning. Yet the figure continued its appearances as if some invisible passenger was traveling with her, visible only through the reflective surfaces of her vehicle. Patricia delivered her cargo to the receiving facility in Missoula at approximately 5:30 p.m. She performed the required paperwork and communication with dispatch, her mind in a fractured state. She couldn't drive back. She simply couldn't. She called her company and reported that she needed to stay overnight before returning to Billings empty. Her dispatcher noted this in her file. Patricia Sullivan, the driver with the perfect record, requesting to not meet her normal schedule. When her dispatcher asked if everything was all right, Patricia assured him that yes, everything was fine. She just needed a little rest. She didn't mention the pale figure in the mirrors, didn't attempt to describe the experience that had accumulated across 6 hours and 230 miles of highway. Patricia spent the night in a motel room, as far from her truck as she could manage while still remaining close enough to monitor it. She showered, ate a modest dinner in the motel restaurant, and went to bed at 8 p.m. She slept poorly, her dreams filled with images of pale faces watching from the dark. The next morning she drove back toward Billings, but she avoided looking at any mirror in the truck. She kept her eyes forward on the road, on her instruments, on the highway ahead. The figure didn't appear when she deliberately refused to look for it. By the time she reached Billings, Patricia had made a decision. She requested a transfer to local delivery work only, routes that kept her within 100 miles of town, routes that didn't require her to navigate the vast empty highways of Montana and surrounding states. Her company was confused. Patricia Sullivan was their star driver, one of their most experienced and reliable operators. Why the sudden change in preferences? Patricia couldn't explain it. She couldn't tell them about the figure, couldn't describe the sensation of being watched from every reflective surface on her vehicle, couldn't express the deep wrongness of seeing something that wasn't there, something that defied all logical explanation and continued to appear regardless of her attempts to disprove or dismiss it. She lasted in the local delivery work for 8 months before the panic attacks became too severe to manage. Patricia Sullivan, the 5-time award winner, the driver with the perfect record, finally left the profession entirely. She bought a small house outside of Billings and took a job in an office, working data entry for a trucking logistics company, the farthest possible remove from the highways while remaining connected to the industry. She never looked in a mirror for an extended period without experiencing a spike in her anxiety. She couldn't explain this to anyone, not even to her therapist, because there was no explanation that didn't sound like evidence of serious mental illness. In the late evening, when she had to look at her reflection in her bathroom mirror, Patricia sometimes found herself scanning the background of the reflection, searching for the pale figure she knew was no longer there, but feared might someday return. Story 3. The Lights of Bakerfield. Michael Chen had been driving commercial truck routes for 31 years. He was methodical, careful, and deeply pragmatic in his approach to highway driving. Michael had learned early in his career that the road was a place for professionals. You didn't daydream, you didn't take risks, you didn't indulge in flights of fancy. You drove safely, You made your deliveries, and you went home to your family. Michael had never experienced an accident, never caused an injury to another human being, and never engaged in the kind of speculative discussion about the unexplained that some drivers seem to enjoy during long stretches on the road. This all changed on a Tuesday night in September of 2023, when Michael was returning from delivering electronics equipment to Los Angeles and was driving northbound on Interstate 5 toward Bakersfield. The night was clear, the traffic relatively light for that time of evening, and Michael was making good time. He'd completed 2/3 of his journey and was anticipating arriving at his terminal in approximately 4 hours. At around 11:15 p.m., roughly 30 miles south of Bakersfield, Michael began noticing unusual lights on the horizon ahead. They were too bright to be car headlights, too geometrically precise to be city lights from a distant town. The lights appeared to be descending from the sky in a pattern that didn't match any conventional aircraft he'd ever seen. Michael watched them with professional detachment as he continued driving north. The lights grew brighter and larger as he approached, eventually resolving into a pattern of approximately 7 distinct spheres of brilliant white illumination, hovering at what seemed to be an altitude of perhaps 300 meters, strung out across the sky like luminous pearls on a cosmic string. Michael checked his CB radio to see if other drivers were reporting the phenomenon, but the channel was quiet. He switched to other common trucking frequencies but heard only normal traffic chatter, drivers making routine communications, road condition reports, the ordinary patterns of truck stop communication. No one was discussing the lights. When Michael glanced back toward the phenomenon, the lights were still visible, descending slightly lower and moving in a way that suggested they were tracking the path of the interstate. The rational part of Michael's mind offered simple explanations. Military aircraft conducting exercises, some kind of experimental drone formation, government testing of new surveillance technology. These were things that existed in the world, unconventional perhaps, but ultimately explainable by conventional science and technology. Michael continued driving north, maintaining his speed, one hand on the wheel and his attention divided between the lights and the road ahead. At approximately 11:47 p.m., Michael passed the exit for Delano, a small town west of the interstate. The lights descended further, now perhaps 200 meters above the highway, and their formation tightened considerably. They were now directly ahead of Michael's truck, suspended in the sky before him, moving at what appeared to be roughly the same speed as his vehicle. Michael could feel something emanating from them. Not a sound or a visible wave, but a presence, a weight of attention, as if the lights themselves were observing him as intently as he was observing them. Michael made a decision. He slowed his truck and moved onto the shoulder of the highway, bringing his vehicle to a complete stop. He killed the engine and sat in silence. The lights continued their descent, dropping another 50 meters in altitude, and Michael found himself staring directly up at them through his windshield. The illumination they produced was so intense that it was causing his eyes to water. He shielded his eyes with his hand, peering through his fingers. That's when Michael noticed something terrifying. His body wouldn't respond to his commands. He tried to move his right hand away from his eyes to check his CB radio, but his arm refused to cooperate. His hand moved as if acting independently of his will, bringing itself back to his face, shielding his eyes from the intense illumination. Michael attempted to speak, to call for help, but his vocal cords produced no sound. His breathing remained calm and steady, his heart rate elevated but not irregular. He could feel everything, could think normally, could perceive and understand, but he possessed no control over his physical form. The lights descended further, now suspended only 30 or 40 meters above his truck. Michael could see that they weren't solid objects exactly, but rather concentrated areas of illumination, as if they were windows into some other place, some other space where blazing white light existed in such abundance that it was spilling through into this reality. The intensity of the illumination increased incrementally, and Michael felt a warmth spreading through his body, beginning at his scalp and radiating downward toward his extremities. Then, just as suddenly as the paralysis had begun, it released. Michael gasped involuntarily, his lungs drawing in a deep breath as if he'd been suffocating. He grabbed the steering wheel with both hands and looked up through the windshield. The lights were ascending rapidly, their descent reversed by whatever intelligence or force controlled them. Within seconds, they'd risen 200 meters. Within seconds more, they'd risen another 200 meters. They continued rising, accelerating now, moving upward at a rate that seemed to defy conventional physics. Within 30 seconds, they disappeared entirely, leaving only the darkness of the clear night sky above the interstate. Michael sat in his cab, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs with such violence that he thought he might be experiencing a cardiac event. His hands were shaking too badly to hold the steering wheel steady. He looked down at his body, checking for any signs of change, any indication of what had happened to him during those minutes of paralysis. He appeared unchanged. His clothing was intact. His skin showed no marks or signs of physical interference. His hands bore no strange markings. Yet something fundamental had shifted within him during that encounter. Michael started his truck with a shaking hand and pulled back onto the highway. He drove north toward Bakersfield at a reduced speed, his mind reeling, trying to process what he'd experienced. He told himself he'd hallucinated, that he'd experienced some kind of medical episode, that he'd fallen asleep and dreamed the entire encounter. Yet the vividness of the experience, the precision of its details, suggested something far more concrete than a dream. As Michael approached Bakersfield proper, the landscape began to change. The highway transitioned from rural to increasingly urban, as residential areas and commercial establishments began to appear alongside the interstate. Michael noticed something that sent a chill through him. The area around Bakersfield was completely dark. No streetlights, no business lights, no vehicle headlights besides his own. The entire city had been plunged into an absolute blackness that seemed impossibly complete. Michael checked his instruments. His CB radio still functioned. The engine ran normally. His headlights illuminated the road ahead precisely as they should. Yet the city around him remained in absolute darkness, as if every electrical system within a radius of perhaps 10 miles had been simultaneously disabled. Michael continued driving north through the dark city, the only point of light in an ocean of absolute black. Then he saw them, figures standing on the shoulder of the highway, illuminated briefly by his headlights as he passed. They appeared human in basic shape, but something about their proportions seemed wrong. Their limbs seemed too long, their movements too synchronized, their heads positioned at angles that suggested their necks bent in ways that human physiology wouldn't allow. Michael counted approximately 30 figures visible on his first pass through the city, scattered along both sides of the highway, all facing toward his truck as if they'd been positioned specifically to observe his passage. Michael pressed the accelerator, increasing his speed. The figures receded behind him as he drove faster, but new ones appeared ahead, stationed at intervals along the highway. Michael realized with horror that they were forming a corridor, positioning themselves in a specific pattern that seemed designed to guide his truck in a particular direction. He attempted to turn off the highway onto a side street, but his steering wheel wouldn't respond to his input. He jerked on it again, applying full force, but the truck continued tracking forward along the interstate, following the corridor formed by the strange figures. Michael's professional composure finally shattered. He hammered on the horn repeatedly, the sound echoing strangely in the absolute silence of the dead city. He attempted once more to turn the steering wheel, throwing his full body weight against it, but the truck remained locked on its course. He pressed the brake pedal with everything he had, but the truck continued forward at its steady speed, the engine responding to no input from his feet. For nearly 40 minutes, Michael was carried through the darkness of Bakersfield in a vehicle he could no longer control, passing the strange figures positioned at intervals along the highway, passing the dark buildings and lifeless streets, feeling utterly powerless and utterly aware that something had assumed control of both him and his vehicle. He prayed with intensity that surprised him, called out to powers he'd long since stopped believing in, and resigned himself to whatever terrible end was waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness had begun, the lights returned. Michael passed the northern boundary of Bakersfield and the city erupted back into normal illumination. Street lights, business signs, traffic lights, all the electronic infrastructure snapping back to life in an instant. Michael suddenly regained control of his truck. The steering wheel responded to his touch, the brakes engaged when he pressed them, and the engine responded to his throttle input. Michael pulled onto the shoulder and sat trembling, unable to drive further. He checked his odometer and his logs. The time and distance showed that he'd traveled through the city in the normal manner at normal speeds. Yet his subjective experience had suggested at least an hour had passed, perhaps longer. His watch confirmed that only 43 minutes had elapsed. Michael reported his truck as experiencing mechanical difficulties and arranged for it to be picked up from his location by another driver. He had a colleague drive him back to the terminal, saying nothing about what had happened. He filed for 2 weeks medical leave and consulted with neurologists, cardiologists, and psychiatrists. No physical explanation emerged. No medical condition could account for his experiences. Michael returned to driving, but he never again passed through Bakersfield. He rerouted all his deliveries to avoid that city. He changed his driving patterns, his routes, his entire professional approach to transportation in order to avoid even coming close to that stretch of California. He developed severe anxiety about driving at night, eventually limiting himself to daytime driving only. Within 3 years, Michael Chen, the pragmatic professional with the perfect record, retired from long-haul trucking entirely. He told himself he'd experienced some kind of psychotic break, some temporary dissociation that had created the appearance of experienced events. But he knew, in the deepest part of himself, that something had happened in Bakersfield. Something that transcended conventional explanation. Something that had marked him profoundly and irrevocably. And the thought that it might happen again to him or to another driver lingered in the back of his mind like a dark shadow that never quite dissipated, even in the brightest daylight. Story 4. The Road with No Exit. Sarah Martinez had accumulated 34 years of professional driving experience and had built her reputation as someone who never made mistakes. She knew highway regulations better than most DOT inspectors, maintained her vehicle with meticulous precision, and had a near-perfect ability to navigate even the most complex routes. Sarah prided herself on her professionalism and her ability to handle any situation that the road presented. In July of 2023, her confidence was shattered by an experience that defied every principle of physics and geography that she'd relied upon her entire career. Sarah was hauling industrial components from Phoenix to Albuquerque, a route that normally took approximately 7 hours depending on traffic and road conditions. She left Phoenix at 5 a.m., intending to arrive in Albuquerque by mid-afternoon. The morning was cool, the highway relatively clear, and Sarah settled in for what she anticipated would be a routine drive across the desert of northern Arizona and into New Mexico. By 9:30 a.m., Sarah had covered approximately 130 miles and was approaching the exit for Holbrook, Arizona. She'd been maintaining her schedule precisely, stopping for fuel and coffee after approximately 4 hours of driving, and was tracking her progress using both her GPS system and her traditional mile marker monitoring. As she approached the exit ramp for Holbrook, her GPS display suddenly began malfunctioning. The screen flickered several times and then returned to normal. But the route displayed was different from what Sarah had programmed. According to her GPS, the next city was now listed as Albuquerque, which should have been approximately 6 hours ahead, not at the exit she was approaching. Sarah dismissed this as a minor glitch. GPS systems failed and reset occasionally. She'd continue past Holbrook as she'd planned. But as she merged from the interstate back onto the main highway toward Albuquerque, she noticed something odd about the landscape. The road ahead didn't look right. She'd driven this route dozens of times and she knew precisely what it looked like. The desert should be opening up into a vast plain with distant mountains visible on the horizon. Instead, the landscape appeared compressed, almost as if the geography itself was distorted in a way that didn't match her memory. Sarah continued forward, telling herself that her perception was simply inaccurate, that the desert landscape looked similar enough in all directions that she was experiencing normal route confusion. But as she drove onward, the strangeness intensified. The miles seemed to pass more slowly than they should. The sun moved across the sky at what appeared to be a normal rate, yet the shadows it cast seemed wrong, as if light was coming from multiple angles simultaneously. The road ahead appeared to stretch toward a distant vanishing point, but when Sarah watched for it, the vanishing point never seemed to arrive. At what should have been mile marker 40, approximately 2 hours of driving from where she'd left the main interstate, Sarah saw a sign indicating the Albuquerque exit. She took the exit, but instead of finding the familiar approach to the city, she found herself on a service road that seemed to loop back toward the main highway. Before she could process what was happening, she was back on the main road driving east again. Sarah pulled over immediately and consulted her GPS. The device showed her location as being approximately 40 miles from Holbrook, exactly where she should be based on her driving time. Yet she'd just circled back to a point she'd already passed. Sarah checked her CB radio and attempted to contact other drivers for confirmation of her location. A brief conversation with another trucker heading east confirmed that she was indeed at the mile marker she'd referenced, with Albuquerque still approximately 170 miles ahead. Sarah resumed driving, but now she was actively monitoring the mile markers, the landscape, and her speed. According to her instruments, she was maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour. According to the mile markers, she was progressing at this normal rate. According to the sun's position and her watch, the time was advancing normally. Yet something about the entire experience began to feel wrong in a way that Sarah couldn't quite articulate. The landscape seemed to be repeating itself. The same mountains visible in the distance, the same rock formations beside the road, the same patterns of vegetation appearing and reappearing as she drove. At approximately 1:15 p.m., Sarah attempted to take the next exit toward Albuquerque that her GPS indicated. As she approached the exit ramp, it began to shimmer and distort, much like a mirage in the desert. The ramp seemed to exist and not exist simultaneously, phasing between states of reality. Sarah's hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel as she watched the exit gradually become solid again. Yet when she reached the actual exit ramp, it was no longer there. The highway continued forward uninterrupted, as if no exit had ever existed. Sarah's heart began racing. She forced herself to breathe steadily and continued forward, now genuinely concerned about her vehicle's systems. Perhaps the GPS was malfunctioning more severely than she'd initially believed. Perhaps she was experiencing some kind of sensory distortion. She continued driving, watching carefully for the next exit that should lead toward Albuquerque. The next exit appeared exactly where her recalculation suggested it should. Sarah took it, following the ramp onto what should have been a service road leading to Albuquerque proper. But the service road curved backward, looping around and returning her to the main highway. Sarah found herself back on the eastbound highway, seeing the same mile marker she'd just passed. For the next 4 hours, Sarah attempted every exit she encountered. Each one looped her back to the main highway. The landscape continued its repetitive cycling. The sun followed a normal progression across the sky, and her clock showed normal time advancing. Yet the Albuquerque exits that should have been available to her seemed to exist in some other configuration of reality, inaccessible to her vehicle. She couldn't return to Holbrook by going backward. When she attempted to drive west, the highway maintained its eastward direction regardless of her steering input. She couldn't turn off the highway to cross the desert directly. Her truck simply continued on the road as if her steering inputs were being overridden. At 5:47 p.m., 8 hours into her drive, Sarah made contact via CB radio with a trucker who claimed to be heading westbound from Albuquerque. According to his position, he should pass her within the next few minutes. Sarah watched carefully in her mirrors, and within several minutes she saw the headlights of an approaching truck in her westbound lane. She watched it approach, pass, and recede into the distance behind her. She immediately contacted the driver and asked him to confirm her position. "You're at mile marker 114 eastbound," the driver confirmed. "You heading to Albuquerque?" "I've been trying to reach Albuquerque for 8 hours, Sarah said, her voice shaking with frustration and fear. "I keep taking exits, but they keep looping me back to this same highway. Something's wrong with the geography." A pause extended across the radio. "I passed through there about 20 minutes ago. The Albuquerque exit was right where it should be. Maybe your eyes are playing tricks or your GPS is really shot. You should stop somewhere and rest. You sound stressed." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to demand an explanation. Instead, she thanked the driver and continued forward. But she now knew with absolute certainty that she was somehow isolated from the normal geography of the route. The exits that should lead to Albuquerque existed for other drivers, but not for her. The landscape was subtly wrong, the progression somehow corrupted, the normal rules of space not applying to her vehicle. At 9:15 p.m., Sarah made a decision. She was going to drive straight ahead into the desert, abandoning the highway entirely. If the exits wouldn't take her to her destination, she would navigate there manually. She found a spot where the highway curved slightly away from the open desert and accelerated toward the gap, attempting to break away from the corrupted route that held her. Her truck refused to obey. The steering wheel locked. The accelerator lost responsiveness. The truck continued forward on the highway, and Sarah realized with horror that whatever was controlling this situation wasn't permitting her to escape. She was trapped in a corridor of geography that was cycling endlessly. An impossible loop where the normal laws of space and distance didn't apply. Sarah continued forward, no longer attempting to resist or escape, simply driving forward into the gathering darkness. At 11:47 p.m. at mile marker 193, she saw the city lights of Albuquerque appearing ahead. She took the exit, held her breath as she waited to be looped back again. But this time, the exit remained stable. The road led forward, the city drew closer, and within a few minutes, Sarah was driving down an Albuquerque city street. The impossible journey finally ended. She found her delivery location by 12:20 a.m. and completed her unloading by 1:30 a.m. Throughout the process, she existed in a dazed state, unable to fully process what had happened. She'd apparently driven from mile marker 40 to mile marker 193, a distance of 150 miles in 19 hours. Her fuel consumption was consistent with this distance. Her logs showed this progression. Yet her subjective experience was of driving the same 50 miles approximately 10 to 12 times, unable to progress, unable to escape. Sarah filed an incident report with her company and requested an immediate transfer to only local delivery work. She was willing to take a reduction in pay, willing to accept reduced hours. She simply couldn't return to that route. Her company granted her request, though with visible concern at her emotional and mental state. Sarah Martinez continued driving for another 2 years before her anxiety about the highway became too severe to manage. She retired at age 56 far earlier than she'd planned because she couldn't return to the roads that had become so fundamentally unpredictable and hostile. She bought a house in New Mexico and refused ever to drive long distances again. She understood with absolute certainty that somewhere in that stretch of highway between Holbrook and Albuquerque, the normal rules of geography had broken down, creating zones where distance couldn't be measured and destinations became unreachable. She never discovered why her route had been affected while other drivers passed through without incident. She never learned whether it was still happening, whether the corrupted geography remained active, waiting to trap another driver in its impossible loop. Story 5. The Voice on Channel 19. David Thornton had been a professional truck driver for 28 years. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply connected to the trucker community through his CB radio. David knew drivers across the entire continental United States, maintained regular conversations with drivers he'd never met in person, and considered his CB interactions to be an important part of his professional life. He was known as someone who would help other drivers, who would warn about road hazards, who would provide conversation and companionship during the long, lonely stretches of highway that characterized the trucker's life. In March of 2023, David was hauling freight from Atlanta to Memphis, a route he drove approximately once per month. He was comfortable on this route, familiar with every exit, every truck stop, every service area. He considered the 390-mile drive to be a straightforward, uncomplicated journey that he could complete in approximately 6 hours, depending on traffic. David departed Atlanta at 8 p.m. on a Wednesday evening, intending to drive through the night and arrive in Memphis by mid-morning Thursday. He'd completed his pre-trip inspection, confirmed his vehicle was mechanically sound, and settled in for what he anticipated would be an uneventful drive. The evening was clear, the highway relatively light on traffic, and David felt comfortable and prepared for the journey ahead. At approximately 10:30 p.m., David was approximately 150 miles out of Atlanta, driving on Interstate 75 northbound through Georgia, when he heard a voice on Channel 19 of his CB radio. Channel 19 was the standard trucker frequency for interstate highways, and David monitored it constantly. The voice was male, mature, and carried a calm professionalism that suggested an experienced driver. "Breaker, breaker, I'm reading some reports of an accident ahead on I-75 northbound, mile marker 205. Appears to be a jackknife trailer and several vehicles involved. Recommend all traffic use caution or consider alternate routes." David acknowledged the report, thanked the driver, and continued forward while processing this information. He wasn't at mile marker 205 yet. He was approximately 20 miles south of that location. He would need to either slow his approach or switch to an alternate route. He checked his navigation options and decided to maintain his current speed but prepare to take an alternate route if the accident situation was as severe as reported. As David approached mile marker 205, he watched carefully for any signs of the accident. At mile marker 201, he began seeing brake lights ahead, indicating traffic congestion. By mile marker 204, he could see the accident clearly. A semi-truck on its side, multiple passenger vehicles damaged, police and emergency vehicles on scene, and traffic being manually directed around the accident by uniformed officers. David slowed to navigate around the accident scene, taking careful note of the situation. The jackknife truck was a Peterbilt similar to his own, the cargo scattered across the roadway. Multiple passenger vehicles showed visible damage. This was clearly a serious incident that had occurred relatively recently, probably within the last 30 minutes or so, given the active response from emergency services. David continued forward on I-75, now approximately 3 miles north of the accident scene. He keyed his CB radio and transmitted, "Thanks for the advance warning about the accident at mile marker 205. Just passed through it. Active emergency response, heavy congestion. Appreciate the heads up." For a moment, nothing but the static of an open channel. Then the same voice that had warned him about the accident responded, "What accident? Wasn't aware of anything at 205. Just came through there about 10 minutes ago. Everything's clear." David frowned. He'd literally just passed the accident scene. He was now only 3 miles north of it. "Negative, there's definitely an accident there. Multiple vehicles involved, semi-truck jackknifed, emergency vehicles on scene. You sure you didn't pass it?" "I'm telling you, I came through mile marker 205 about 10 minutes ago and it was clear. Maybe you got your locations mixed up." David was certain of his location. His odometer confirmed his position within reasonable accuracy. "I'm telling you, I just passed it. Definitely at mile marker 205. "Well, something's not adding up here," the other driver said, "because I was just there and there's nothing." The conversation ended without resolution. David felt unsettled by the exchange but didn't dwell on it. Perhaps the other driver had come through a few minutes before the accident occurred, or perhaps he'd switched to a different route without realizing it. There could be simple explanations for the discrepancy. But then, at approximately 11:15 p.m., the same voice returned on Channel 19. "Big Blue, you're David Thornton, right? The Peterbilt out of Atlanta?" David was surprised. His handle on the CB was Big Blue, but drivers rarely used real names in their transmissions. "That's me. You got me at a disadvantage. What's your handle?" "I'm the one who warned you about the accident, or tried to. I just wanted to ask, where are you exactly right now?" "I'm mile marker 227, approximately 40 miles north of where we talked before." "Why?" A pause. "Okay. I'm going to tell you something, and you're probably going to think I'm crazy, but I just checked with another driver, someone I know well, and he's confirming something that doesn't make any sense. There's no accident at mile marker 205. There was never any accident there. My buddy just came through, and it's clear." "But you said you just drove past an accident, right?" "Correct. I saw it clearly, passed it approximately 15 minutes ago." "I don't think you did," the voice said quietly. "I don't think that accident exists. Or it exists for you, but not for anyone else. I don't know which is more frightening." David's skin began to crawl. He told himself this was nonsense, that the driver was confused or intentionally messing with him. Yet something about the conversation felt deeply wrong. "Are you saying what I experienced wasn't real?" "I'm saying maybe it was real for you, but it's not real for anyone else. I wanted to warn you. I wanted to tell you to get off I-75 and switch to an alternate route. Something's wrong with your journey, and I don't think you should stay on that highway." Before David could respond, the transmission ended. He tried to raise the other driver on Channel 19, but there was no response. He tried again several minutes later, and the channel remained empty. The driver who'd warned him about the non-existent accident was no longer transmitting. David continued forward on I-75, but now he was actively monitoring his surroundings for signs of the impossible. The highway ahead appeared normal, the traffic steady, the landscape passing in the expected manner. He pressed onward through the night, listening to CB chatter and watching the mile markers progress at their normal rate. At mile marker 270, approximately 60 miles after his conversation with the mysterious driver, David was approaching Chattanooga, Tennessee. He could see the glow of the city ahead. The night was clear, the traffic normal, the highway standard. David keyed his CB to attempt one more conversation with the mysterious driver. If you're listening, I'm at mile marker 270 heading into Chattanooga. Whatever warning you were trying to give me, I haven't noticed anything unusual since we last talked. For a long moment, only static. Then the voice returned and David's blood ran cold because he recognized immediately that it was no longer the same driver. The voice was different, a younger man, uncertain and frightened. "Where are you?" the voice asked. "I'm mile marker 270. Who is this?" "I'm Big Blue. I'm David Thornton. I'm on I-75 at mile marker 270. But that's impossible because I'm also here at mile marker 270 and I'm looking at my odometer and I am absolutely at mile marker 270 right now." David felt ice spreading through his chest. "What are you talking about? Who are you really?" "I'm you," the voice said. "Or a version of you. I don't understand what's happening. There's another truck ahead of me on the highway, and I think that truck might also be driven by someone named David Thornton. I think we're all on the same highway, all at the same location, separated by something I can't quite perceive." "How many of us are there?" David tried to process what he was hearing. The hypothesis that came to mind was so insane that he almost rejected it outright. Yet the evidence seemed to support it. "How long have you been driving?" "About 3 hours." David checked his elapsed driving time. "I've been on this route for 6 hours. I should be approximately 80 miles ahead of you. But if we're both at mile marker 270, then we're not," the other voice finished. "We're on different versions of the same road, or the same road existing in multiple states simultaneously. Oh God, this is insane. This is absolutely insane." David heard the sound of an engine accelerating, and he realized the other driver was attempting to escape the impossible situation by driving faster. David did the same, pressing his accelerator forward, watching his speedometer climb to 80 miles per hour, then 90. But his odometer and his mile marker observations remained constant. He stayed at mile marker 270, unable to progress forward despite his increased speed. Meanwhile, the other voice on the CB continued transmitting, reporting the same phenomenon. Multiple voices began appearing on Channel 19, all claiming to be David Thornton, all reporting being at mile marker 270, all expressing varying degrees of fear and confusion. Some of the voices seemed to have been on the road for only minutes. Others reported driving for hours. All of them were at the same location, unable to progress. David turned off his CB radio. The overlap of identical voices claiming to be him, all trapped at the same impossible location, was triggering a panic response that he couldn't quite control. He exited I-75 at the nearest exit, abandoning the highway and driving onto local roads, heading roughly toward Memphis, but no longer attempting to follow the interstate. As soon as he left the interstate, the radio noise stopped. The impossible versions of himself disappeared. David found his way to Memphis following local roads and smaller highways, avoiding I-75 entirely. He completed his delivery and immediately requested a transfer to routes that didn't involve I-75. When his company questioned this request, David found himself unable to explain it without sounding insane. He lasted another 18 months before his anxiety about driving became too severe to manage. David Thornton left professional driving and took a job managing logistics from an office. His career on the road ended by an experience that still didn't have a rational explanation. He never used CB radio again, and he couldn't hear the specific frequency of Channel 19 without experiencing a spike in his heart rate and anxiety levels. The mysterious drivers who'd warned him. The impossible multiplication of his own identity at the same location. The breakdown of linear progression along a familiar highway. None of it had ever been adequately explained. David simply accepted that he'd experienced something that the normal rules of physics and identity couldn't accommodate. and he'd spent the rest of his life trying not to think too carefully about what that might mean. Story 6. The Cargo That Whispered. Jennifer Hayes had driven commercial freight for 26 years and prided herself on her professionalism and her ability to handle any cargo regardless of unusual specifications. She'd transported everything from medical equipment to agricultural products to specialized machinery. She maintained perfect compliance with all regulations and never asked unnecessary questions about the contents of her cargo. She picked up her load, verified the bill of lading, followed the delivery instructions, and completed her journey. This simple professionalism had defined her career and kept her steadily employed through economic fluctuations that had forced other drivers to relocate or change professions. In August of 2023, Jennifer received an unusual cargo transport request. She was to pick up a load from a warehouse in Las Vegas and deliver it to a receiving facility in Phoenix. The cargo was listed as specialized laboratory equipment, fragile, with explicit instructions that she maintain a consistent speed of 55 miles per hour throughout the journey and that she travel only during daylight hours. The payment was substantially higher than normal for such a route. Jennifer's company had confirmed that all specifications were legitimate and had encouraged her to accept the job. Jennifer collected the cargo on a Monday morning at 6:00 a.m. The loading process took approximately 2 hours, as workers carefully positioned sealed metal containers onto her trailer. The containers were secured with heavy chains and padding, and the entire load was covered with a tarpaulin. The bill of lading listed 47 separate items, all marked fragile and laboratory equipment. Jennifer wasn't provided with any more detailed information about the contents, which was consistent with standard practice for sensitive or proprietary cargo. Jennifer began her journey at 8:30 a.m. on a clear morning, heading south on US 95 toward the Arizona border. The drive to Phoenix normally took approximately 5.5 hours depending on traffic, but Jennifer was instructed to maintain 55 miles per hour and to make specific stops at designated locations every 2 hours. She was provided with an envelope containing detailed instructions about which facilities to stop at and at what times. This level of specification was unusual but not unprecedented for sensitive cargo. The journey began normally. Jennifer maintained her specified speed, passed through the Arizona border without incident, and stopped at the designated facilities on her schedule. At each stop, she was instructed to remain in her vehicle and ensure no one approached her trailer. She followed these instructions precisely. It was approximately halfway through her journey at around 11:30 a.m. that Jennifer first heard it. A sound emanating from her cargo, a quiet whispering as if multiple voices were speaking simultaneously but at such a low volume that individual words were indistinguishable. Jennifer checked her CB radio, assuming the sound was coming from another driver's transmission, but the channel was clear. She adjusted her radio and found the same whispering present on every frequency. She muted the CB and the whispering continued, seemingly coming from behind her cab, from the direction of her trailer. Jennifer tried to dismiss the sound as mechanical noise from her truck, the wind creating acoustic effects, mechanical components vibrating, engine sounds interpreting in unusual ways. Yet the whispering seemed too coherent to be mechanical noise. The cadence and rhythm of the voices suggested actual language, actual communication, as if her cargo was attempting to speak. Jennifer continued driving, maintaining her 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, telling herself that the strange audio was a product of her tired mind playing tricks on her. She'd been awake since 4 a.m. and had been driving for approximately 3 hours. Auditory hallucinations could be caused by fatigue. She would stop at the next designated facility, rest for the required 30 minutes, and resume driving with a fresher mental state. But when she pulled into the designated truck stop and stopped her engine, the whispering continued in the sudden silence. Jennifer got out of her cab and walked around to the back of her trailer, checking the sealed containers and the chains securing the load. Everything appeared perfectly normal. The containers were undamaged, the tarps intact, nothing visibly wrong. She returned to her cab, restarted the engine, and continued forward. The whispering intensified over the next hour, gradually increasing in volume until Jennifer could almost make out individual words. The voices seemed to be layered, multiple speakers creating a harmonic effect that was somehow both musical and deeply unsettling. Jennifer experimented with her hearing, focusing on the whispering, attempting to extract meaning from the overlapping voices. The sounds had the rhythm and pacing of language, the emotional cadence of actual speech, but the words themselves remained just beyond comprehension. At 2 p.m., Jennifer pulled into the second designated rest stop and experienced the same phenomenon. The whispering continued even with her engine killed, even in the sudden silence of the parked truck. She sat in her cab, listening to the mysterious voices emanating from her sealed cargo, and felt a cold certainty settling into her mind. Whatever she was hearing was real. Whatever was producing the whispering was genuine, not a product of fatigue or stress. Her cargo was communicating, attempting to speak to her, and she had another 3 hours of driving ahead of her before reaching Phoenix. Jennifer restarted her truck and returned to the highway. The whispering had now resolved itself into something approaching coherence. Individual words began to emerge from the harmonic overlay of voices. Jennifer leaned forward, straining to understand the message her cargo was attempting to convey. She could make out fragments, numbers, technical terms, but also something that sounded like warnings, repeated over and over. "Don't stop, 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 stop." Jennifer's hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Every professional instinct told her to pull over, to contact her dispatch, to report the unusual cargo behavior. Yet the explicit instructions she'd been given included warnings not to open the containers under any circumstances, warnings not to deviate from her prescribed route, warnings that the cargo required specific atmospheric conditions that would be disrupted if the vehicle wasn't maintained in precise parameters. At 3:15 p.m., the whispering reached a crescendo. The voices overlapped into a unified chorus, all speaking the same word simultaneously. 37. Jennifer felt a chill spread down her spine. She had been driving for exactly 37 minutes since her last stop. She'd traveled exactly 37 miles. Her CB radio had been silent except for the whispering for the past 37 minutes. The number repeated again and again in the unified chorus of her cargo. 37, 37, 37. Jennifer's hands jerked involuntarily on the steering wheel, and she suddenly became aware that she'd been driving faster than her prescribed speed limit. Her speedometer showed 62 miles per hour. She immediately eased off the accelerator, returning to 55. But something had shifted in her awareness. She realized that her conscious mind had not intended to increase her speed. Something else had overridden her muscle memory and controlled her limbs. Jennifer pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway and stopped her truck completely. She sat in the sudden silence after killing the engine, listening to the whispering continue unabated from her cargo. The voices had decreased in volume but maintained their intensity, and she could now clearly understand the message they were conveying. The voices were counting. They were counting in ascending order, starting from 1, progressing methodically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Jennifer opened the driver's door and stepped out onto the shoulder of the highway. She walked to the back of her trailer, her hands shaking, her mind in turmoil. She could now clearly hear the whispering emanating from within the sealed containers. The counting continued, each number distinctly enunciated. 23, 24, 25. Jennifer made a decision that violated every explicit instruction she'd been given. She found her cutting torch in the toolkit beneath her cab and returned to the sealed containers. She cut through the heavy chain securing the tarpaulin and pulled back the heavy fabric. The sealed metal containers were visible beneath. They were not the laboratory equipment she'd been told they contained. They were something else entirely, geometric shapes that didn't quite make sense to her eyes, surfaces that seemed to shift color despite the container being completely still. The counting and the whispering voices accelerated. 86, 87, 88, 89, 90. Jennifer ran back to her cab and started her truck. She abandoned her cargo on the highway shoulder and drove away at maximum speed, heading toward Phoenix. Behind her, she could hear the whispering voices reaching a crescendo, the countdown accelerating, the message becoming increasingly urgent. Jennifer delivered herself to the Phoenix dispatch facility and reported her cargo abandoned on the highway. She resigned from her position immediately. When authorities investigated the abandoned containers, they found nothing except standard laboratory equipment, exactly as described on the bill of lading. The containers showed no signs of having been opened. The cutting marks from Jennifer's torch were barely visible on the securing chain. Jennifer Hayes never returned to long-haul trucking. She took a job as a local delivery driver for a small company, limiting her routes to a 50-mile radius of her home. She refused all requests for longer hauls, and she never again transported specialized cargo with unusual specifications. She told herself that she'd experienced some kind of stress-induced psychotic break, a hallucination created by her tired mind and the monotony of the highway. Yet she knew with absolute certainty that whatever had been in those containers had been attempting to communicate with her, and she'd made the right decision in abandoning them. She never learned what the cargo actually contained, and she had no desire to ever find out. Story 7. The Mirror Image Mile. Thomas Brooks had been driving 18-wheelers for 39 years, a stretch of time that blurred from one decade into the next, marked only by the fading brands of trucks and the slow graying of his hair. People in the Texas Hall business called him Tommy Mirrors because of his endless double-checking of everything that moved or glinted in a side glass pane. It was a habit born of both paranoia and pride, a habit that had kept his record spotless through almost 3 million accident-free miles and 4 different carriers. But on a cold Thursday in October of 2023, it was precisely this habit that ruined his faith in the world. By then, Thomas was only months away from retirement. He'd already bought a spread out in Springtown, with pastures so green they looked fake, and he'd made a solemn promise that this particular route from Fort Worth to Houston and back would be one of his last. The morning started like so many before it, a bleary-eyed walk across a gravel lot, his boots crunching in darkness, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and the logbook in the other. His Peterbilt's chrome gleamed in the sodium lights, and as Thomas climbed up, he patted the dashboard like a horse's flank. "Come on, old girl," he muttered. "Let's make it a clean run." His delivery was agricultural machinery heading south. The sun never seemed to properly rise that morning. The sky stayed the color of old slate, promising autumn rain. Beyond the outskirts of Dallas, the highway yawned into oil country, the land flat and lonely, the air thick with the distant sweet sting of refineries. Thomas set his cruise control at 67, flipped his CB to channel 13 and rolled south. Every sound and blur outside the cab instantly familiar. He'd been on the road around 2 hours, marking time by mileposts and the next refill of his coffee when the trouble started. At precisely 9:18 a.m., Thomas checked his passenger-side convex mirror for merging cars out of habit. Instead, his hand froze on the shifter. There was another truck in his mirror, not behind him, alongside him. Same make, same navy blue cab, the same scratched and faded Lone Star State sticker on the door. It matched his speed precisely, shadowing him so perfectly that their tires spun in unison. The only difference was that this truck existed only in the glass. It wasn't actually on the road beside him. Thomas's heart thumped. He blinked rapidly, then looked over his shoulder. Nothing. The next lane was empty, but the mirror kept showing the shadow rig. He adjusted the mirror physically. The reflection changed angles, but the phantom kept pace, unblinking and solid as a ghost could be. In the next moment, as traffic thickened, Thomas merged left to pass a slow-moving van. But in the mirror, the phantom truck followed, merging simultaneously, so close he half choked on surprise. "Jesus Christ," Thomas whispered. His fingers trembled against the wheel. He tried to rationalize it. Sun glare, stress, a trick of foggy glass. He'd seen weird illusions before. So he pulled off at a truck stop, wiped the mirrors until his gloves squeaked on the glass, and splashed his face with cold water in the grimy restroom. Another driver, a woman named Trina who knew him from Houston runs, strolled by while he stood in the parking lot staring at his rig. "Something up, Tommy. You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas hesitated, then muttered, "Just tired. My eyes ain't what they used to be." Inside, fear scratched at the edges of his composure. When he got back on the road, everything seemed normal for another 8 miles, but as soon as he checked his mirror, out of reflex, he couldn't help it. The phantom was there again. This time, Thomas steeled himself and waved his right hand out the window, watching the mirror intently. In the reflection, the driver of the matching truck did the exact same thing. A mirrored version. The same ring on his pinky, the same brown spots on the hand, even the same worn checkered work shirt. Only, of course, the lane itself was empty. Thomas felt a wave of dizziness. His coffee soured in his gut. He tried to break the illusion. He sped up, and the shadow truck kept pace. He slowed to a crawl. It matched him inch for inch. For the next 50 miles, no matter what he did, the phantom truck wouldn't go away. When he exited for a fuel stop, the mirror-clearing ritual bought him a brief reprieve, but as soon as he merged back onto the highway, there it was. The same blue Peterbilt with the same scuffed marker lights riding his ghostly shoulder. Rain washed across the windshield, streaking the world into silver gray. Thomas's palms grew clammy, his leg tapping uncontrollably against the worn-out clutch. When the mirrors began to fog on the inside, he gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles whitened, heart racing. He kept checking, staring at the doppelganger until his eyes ached. Then the radio crackled. The voice on his usually quiet CB channel was his own. "Tommy, you see it too?" Thomas's mouth dried instantly. He stared at the radio mic as if it were a snake, then hesitantly pressed the button. "Who is this?" There was only static, then the voice answered again, distant, fainter with a static-laced echo, but undeniably his own. "It's me, Tommy. I'm right here." Thomas squeezed his eyes shut for one heartbeat and then checked the mirror again. The driver in the other truck, himself unmistakable, turned to look at him, raising a hand in a gesture Thomas hadn't made. Not this time. Fear finally won out. Thomas took the next exit, driving fast and reckless for someone with his spotless record. At a rest area, he parked, killed the engine, and sat in the stifling silence of the cab. After 3 deep breaths, he convinced himself he'd had a panic attack or a stroke or some kind of neurological incident. He'd heard about such things among drivers, years on the road, endless patterns, the mind's eye conjuring echoes of itself. Perhaps this wasn't the first sign of something medical. He thought about calling his daughter, but the shame and confusion kept him silent. But when he looked once more in the mirror, the blue Peterbilt was parked beside him. Unreal, impossible, instantly gone when he looked directly. He tried sleeping in the cab that night, too exhausted and afraid to get a hotel. Every dream was a kaleidoscope of mirrors. In everyone, he saw hundreds of versions of himself, all stuck staring, all trapped behind glass. At sunrise, Thomas resolved to finish the Houston delivery and request early retirement regardless of the financial penalty. He made the run, driving blurry-eyed, with exhaustion, but as soon as he hit the open stretch after Conroe, the phenomenon intensified. Now every reflective surface, mirrors, the windshield at certain angles, even the gleam of his phone screen briefly showed the phantom Peterbilt and his own aging features. The highway became dreamlike, every mile marker identical, every truck stop just another repetition. Time seemed to stretch. He'd check the clock and find that only a minute had passed despite the endless feeling of motion. At his Houston delivery yard, an old-timer approached him, eyeing his trembling hands and drawn face. "You all right, Brooks? You look like a man who's seen the devil." Thomas laughed shakily. Maybe something worse. But the questions didn't stop. That night, every sound in the truck yard, clanging tools, distant laughter, the whir of forklifts, seemed to echo infinitely, looping back on themselves. His final drive back to Fort Worth was the worst. The mirror image sometimes lagged and then sped ahead by impossible increments, briefly showing stretches of highway that Thomas hadn't reached yet. At one point, the reflection displayed a sign he'd see only 5 minutes down the road. Once, the face looking back at him was older. A hunched, hollow-eyed man in a trucker cap bleached completely white by time. In his last 50 miles before retirement, Thomas stopped using mirrors at all, driving coward blind into the gray Texas dusk, chewing his tongue to keep himself grounded in the real. The odometer ticked. The miles vanished beneath his wheels, and his mind circled back again and again to the futures he might have lived, or might still live, trapped forever in the glass of his Peterbilt, somewhere just out of phase with reality. When Thomas turned in his keys, he told his boss simply, "I'm done." No explanation, no drama. He refused to ever drive a big rig again, leaving the yard with the sense he'd left some irretrievable part of himself behind, caught somewhere between two worlds, riding shotgun forever in the mirror's memory. He never looked in a truck mirror for the rest of his life. At home in Springtown, even the glint of car windows on his ranch at dawn sent a spike of cold fear through him. He lived out the remainder of his days in quiet, always feeling watched, always feeling that somewhere out there he was still driving, not just forward but sideways in time, endlessly shadowed by his own reflection, doomed to repeat the same miles with no escape. Story 8. The Night That Lasted Forever. Kevin Richardson's reputation was ironclad across the western states. 25 years, no missed deliveries, the sort of old-school reliability dispatchers used as a threat for younger drivers. Be like Kevin, they'd say. Kevin himself was by no means superstitious. He trusted odometers, paper logs, and his gut, not ghost stories, not truck stop gossip about Highway 80 time slips or dark miles. All that changed on a night in December of 2023. A night that would rip his grip on reality to shreds. That afternoon, Kevin left Sacramento in his Freightliner Cascadia, a contract load bound for San Francisco. He'd traveled that route so many times that he could list every rest area and the location of every CB dead zone by memory. The job was this: deliver the temperature-sensitive cargo to a warehouse by 10 p.m. sharp. No window for error. Growing fog licked up from the valleys and traffic moved like molasses as dusk approached. Kevin rolled through Vallejo at 7:42 p.m. The radio was tuned to the endless warble of trucker chatter. He glanced at his watch, calculated his arrival, and pressed on. Just past Suisun City, the orange sun brushed the horizon, and something odd happened. The light paused, then bled backward. The sky, rather than deepening, brightened again as if somebody was spinning the time-lapse of sunset in reverse. Confused, Kevin slowed and checked his dash clock. 7:47 p.m. Again. That same number blinked for an entire minute, then 2. When he looked up, the world outside had shifted 3 degrees lighter. The sun teetered higher, and the shadows on the roadside grew longer. He clicked the radio to NPR, then classic rock, then news. All programming froze, caught in a loop of half-broadcast sentences and static. Kevin wasn't the kind to panic about clocks. He pressed the accelerator. The truck responded and the miles passed. But at the next highway sign, Benicia, 10 miles, the number didn't change after 5 minutes of driving. Every landmark on Route 12 appeared, then repeated. The same painted barn roof, the same crosswinds, the twisted wreck of a Volvo in the median. He gripped the wheel until his knuckles burned, switching off the radio. The silence felt wrong. Kevin checked the dashboard again. Still 7:47 p.m. For one wild second, he wondered if he'd died, if this was some kind of afterlife. Then the real fear set in. He'd entered a patch of the world where time was stuck. His GPS repeated a simple set of coordinates. The screen flickered, then dumped him back at the exact latitude and longitude from 6 minutes ago. Panic began in his chest, spreading cold, and he forced himself to breathe and think. Just a mechanical glitch. Fog's interfering with reception. At the outskirts of Oakland, everything grew suddenly silent. Not traffic. There was none. Not even the distant thrum of power lines or city noises. Kevin's headlights cut forward, carving cone-shaped pools of illumination out of a void. Structures appeared and disappeared on the roadside. Sometimes the same gas station, always closed, sometimes a church, sometimes nothing but thick banks of mist. He checked his phone, hoping for a text or a news update explaining some regional blackout, but all signals were dead. The phone's clock, too, had frozen. He tried to call, dispatch on CB, but the only thing he heard was his own voice, a perfect echo, a sound that looped back a second late, as if replying from another room. "Dispatcher, this is K. Rich. Are you receiving? I'm late. I got..." Then his own words. "I'm late. I got..." Battery after battery swapped, but the pattern remained. Worse, the dome light wouldn't turn off in the cab. He'd flip the switch, and it would brighten instead. Every attempt to impose order on his truck's controls produced the opposite effect. From the corner of his eye, he noticed something impossible in the side mirror, a distant line of headlights, perfectly spaced, framing his truck in both directions. He counted, then recounted. There were always 11 pairs, no matter how fast he went. As the night sped on, or stayed still for there was no way to measure the passing, Kevin began to feel the weight of exhaustion, though he'd napped before the route. He tried to pull into a rest area, but the exit veered in a different direction each time he passed it, reshaping as soon as he signaled. Once, the ramp dissolved into mist, plunging him back onto the highway with a jolt. He forced the cab's windows down, letting cold December air slap his face. There were moments when the landscape shimmered, road signs unfurling with odd, reversed letters, gas station logos drawn backward. He heard snatches of music on the wind, nothing modern. Big band jazz from the 40s, then suddenly gone. It was somewhere beyond Martinez that he saw another world through the glass. Past the fogged-up windshield, a separate highway ran parallel, muted and half-seen. Trucks drove backward while he moved forward. Every now and again, headlights would pass on his left, but when he tried to glimpse the driver, it was always himself. Different hats, younger sometimes blank-faced and ancient. Kevin realized with existential horror that he might be seeing past or future versions of himself caught in the same loop. And still at every check, the clock read 7:47 p.m. By what felt like dawn, though the sun never rose, Kevin's dashboard mourned low fuel, a thing that shouldn't be possible given the drive time. He stopped counting the infinite loops as nausea overtook him. One after another, mile markers scrolled by in perfect order, though he would swear he saw some marker numbers repeat out of order. 133, 134, 132, 133 again, 135. In the dead hours, Kevin remembered stories he'd heard at truck stops. The fixed night on West 80 where drivers swore they'd travel 100 miles in a town that never shifted out of midnight. The ghost exit on I-5 North that appeared only in certain fogs. He had never believed in any of it. Finally, the world shifted again. The sky, which had held to forever dusk, blinked to full black. For the first time in countless loops, a car passed him, an old sedan, impossible to recall in any detail, trailing a red scarf out the window. Kevin, desperate, followed in its wake. The landscape blurred, clouds swirled and parted, and in a single blink he found himself on a city street, deep in San Francisco. The clock on his dash jumped to 9:11 p.m. His GPS, suddenly alive, chirped, "Arrival calculated." Stunned and shaking, Kevin pulled to his destination, a warehouse that looked older somehow, paint peeling and weeds pushing through concrete. His delivery papers showed the right name, the right address. No one came to meet him. He wandered the block searching for another soul before returning to his cab. The night outside no longer matched anything inside his head. It was as if time had snapped forward. His mind still cycled endlessly between dusk and dusk. But the city had moved on. Kevin checked online for news. A total blank. The company number on the warehouse letterhead had been disconnected for years. He drove to a police station and tried to explain. "I've been driving for days," he gasped, but the logs on his GPS told another story. A 3-hour drive, some lost signal, nothing more. The officer told him to get some rest. Kevin, too stricken to argue, checked into a motel. He would later fail every psych evaluation, unfit for the road. No amount of therapy or explanation ever convinced him that those countless loops weren't real. In the years that followed, Kevin wandered the world of the living but never felt truly awake again. Even sunlight looked false. Every clock seemed unreliable. Sometimes late at night in spring, he checked the old dash clock from his retired rig, and there it was, still stuck, 7:47 p.m. And he wondered, as all the old truckers did, exactly what waited for drivers on lonely roads in the fog, out past the reach of radio and ordinary time. A night that never ended, a loop with no exit, and the knowledge that no road, no journey, ever truly ends.